We have Paul Levinson, who is a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York City. He's published numerous books of nonfiction, including The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, and Real Space. He's also written science fiction novels and was listed as one of the top 10 academic Twitterers in 2009. Paul will be speaking first. Following.
Like it's working fine.
Okay.
You can hear me?
Yeah, it sounds great.
Good.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. I could listen to introductions like that all day, but instead I'll start talking to you about the global village and Occupy Wall Street. Let's start with the global village, which, as I'm sure all of you know, goes back to the 1960s and in particular first received public attention with Marshall McLuhan's book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, that was published way back in 1962, when McLuhan observed, in effect, that electronic media are turning the world into a global village. Now, probably of all of McLuhan's ideas and aphorisms and comments, the global village received the most immediate and continuing public attention. A lot of people have heard of the medium as the message, but more people have heard of the global village. And you hear it on television, in classrooms. If you stop the average person on any college campus today and mention global village to them, it would certainly ring with some familiarity. And the interesting thing about the global village is that back in 1962, it was completely a metaphor and had almost no existence in reality. It was a great metaphor because it pointed the way to the future, but it was fundamentally and through a metaphor. If you think about it, back in 1962, people were watching television, and you did have large groups of people watching the same television show at the same time. But the largest that any group was in 1962 was a national group, not an international group. So you might have everyone in the United States watching a television show, everyone in the UK, everyone in Canada, but they were not all watching the same show. So in that sense, in 1962, the village that McLuhan was talking about was certainly not global. It was at most a series of national villages. Still very impressive, but not global. But of even more significance, back in 1962, is that the nature of those audiences, those national audiences, really did not have many of the characteristics that we would commonly say would be associated with a village. For example, in a typical village, you walk down Main Street and you can have a conversation with one or more people very easily. In other words, intrinsic and essential to village life and to the village experience is an interactivity among the villagers. Well, back in 1962, the people who were watching television, they could have an interactive experience with someone standing right next to them or sitting right next to them, say a family member or an office worker or someone sitting next to them in a bar having a drink, but that was not on a national level at all. In fact, the only interactivity in that village back in 1962 was the interactivity of anyone in your physical presence. You needed, in other words, physical proximity to have interactivity, and that meant that whether the village was national or local, it was not really a village. unless we would suddenly begin thinking of villages as places in which people could see and hear, but could not communicate among themselves. That would be a strange village, wouldn't it? It would be a village of voyeurs. So the global village back in 1962 was really a sign that was pointing to the future and the way that communications and media would be shaping our lives. It was not a description of the world back in 1962. One of the things I've said about all of McLuhan's brilliant work is that he was not writing about his world. He was writing about our world. This world right now, for example, where here I am a few miles north of New York City, and I'm talking to you in Winnipeg, on the other side of the continent. That's very easy nowadays. That was not really possible in 1962. And McLuhan made, as you all know, many, many observations about many different things. One of the other observations that has received much less attention than the global village, but always struck me as a writer as a significant observation. And this was made in the early 1970s when McLuhan observed that the Xerox, that is the photocopying machine, was turning every author into a publisher. And what that meant, what McLuhan had in mind then, is prior to the Xerox machine, if someone wrote something and was interested in getting it published, the only choice they would have, the only option they would have would be to bring it to a publisher who would then undertake to print up copies. But as soon as the Xerox or photocopying became available, that goes back to the 1940s, you could write something either in longhand or type it up and then bring it to a Xerox place and have whatever number of copies you liked printed up. But there again, the reality of that publishing was much less than the metaphor indicated, because how many copies of the manuscript could you have photocopied? And then how would you get those into bookstores and how would you get them distributed? So the publisher that resulted from the Xerox machine was not really a full-fledged publisher. But once again, as with the Global Village, McLuhan was hitting upon a very important idea, which is that the trajectory, the arc of media evolution was bending towards the consumer becoming a producer. Because it is true that if you go to the local Xerox shop, if you went to that shop in 1962, the instant you brought your typewritten manuscript into that Xerox shop, you were becoming a producer. You were no longer a consumer. As far as the Global Village is concerned, it became clear to me back in the really early 1990s when you first had people communicating through the internet, that now for the first time, there are people who were able to communicate on a global level, the way we're communicating right now. So with the internet, the global part of the global village crystallized from a metaphor into a reality. And what then happened is the next stage of the process, the idea of an interactive village in which people could communicate, also became a reality, because just as that communication was global, so it was interactive. Now, obviously, you'll be able to ask me questions at the end of this session, and that's certainly an interactive kind of communication. Hello?
Here we go. We're back. Hi, you're back.
Hello?
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Can you see me?
Yes.
All right. Well, I think we lost our connection. I'm not sure what you heard. I was saying that in the 1990s, the global village began to become a reality. Did you hear me say that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, we heard that, yeah.
Okay. So, just to repeat a little bit, but to make sure you didn't miss anything, what I was saying is in the 1990s, for the first time, people were able to communicate globally on the internet, and they were also able to communicate interactively. So, if you think about email, which actually goes back to the 1980s, and you think about comments that people would make in chat rooms, and they'll
Oh, this is the second one. It'll resume. He'll call back and we'll get reconnected. There's a lot of, I guess, congestion.
hello.
Ah, you're back. Right on.
All right, good. I'll get my video. Okay. All right. So I was saying that what happened in the 1990s was just the beginning of the both globalization and the interactivity of the communication systems. And in particular, what began to happen in the 21st century was a development of media that we now call, most people call social media. I also call them, however, new media. Let me explain to you why I do that. A new medium is anything that takes place online. But if you think about, buying a book on Amazon, reading the New York Times online, listening to music on iTunes, those three experiences are all online internet experiences. They all involve new media. But in none of those experiences does the consumer become a producer. In fact, there's no difference from the point of view of the consumer or reader in the process of reading the New York Times online. There's really no difference in that process, and reading the New York Times on paper. And in fact, differences that do exist are only differences in terms of the ease with which you can consume that information. So you can log on to the New York Times anytime and read it. You have to wait until the paper is delivered to your doorstep to read it. But in both of those cases, you are still a consumer. But now think in contrast about any blog that you might be reading online as a consumer. You can, in most cases, instantly comment on what you are reading in that blog. And you can do more than that. You can just about instantly set up your own blog where you can write either responses to the blog you were reading or write about something completely different. The process of blogging was one of the first processes in which the consumer became a producer. And because there are such significant differences, I think, in the empowerment of consumers to become producers, that calling these media just new media doesn't work. And even calling them social media, I think, although I'm realistic enough to realize I'm not going to change the world and get the world to start not calling them social media. But social media is not the best description because all media are intrinsically social. Even old media are social. I mean, if you read a book and you talk to your friend about the book, that's a social function. So I think that these new media are more than social media because they empower consumers to become producers. It has happened across the board. The Encyclopedia Britannica announced a few months ago that it's no longer printing up paper editions. It would just have an online version. But even that online version of the Encyclopedia Britannica consists of articles that are commissioned by the Britannica's editors and written by experts. In contrast, Wikipedia can be written by anyone. A lot of people are concerned, well, doesn't that mean that people can put up all kinds of nonsense on Wikipedia? And the answer is yes. People do put up nonsense all the time. But there was a study done in Nature magazine a few years ago that showed the number of errors in Wikipedia was pretty much statistically equivalent to the number of errors in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And the Britannica people were furious about that. But nonetheless, that's what the study showed. And the reason for this same level, very low level of error is Wikipedia has its own error correction system, which again involves the readers becoming producers or editors. So anyone who reads an article on Wikipedia, if they see a mistake, they can correct it. So in other words, the same empowerment of the consumer into a producer in an online encyclopedia provides a natural immune system for error. And that everyone who reads Wikipedia is potentially a white blood cell who can go attack the infection of error, and in fact does. And you can just look at every single new medium and see the same kind of dynamics. YouTube. You don't just watch what's on YouTube, you can upload your own video to YouTube. So I'm sure a video of what I'm now saying will be on YouTube very soon. Hi, everyone who's watching this on YouTube. So in all of those cases, you have consumers becoming producers, having much, much more power, rather than the indirect power that people had in the old media systems. The indirect power of, well, if you didn't like a television show, you didn't have to watch it, and eventually if it didn't get enough viewers, it might get taken off the air, but you couldn't produce your own television show. And this has had profound consequences, and this brings me to the second part of our consideration today. Not just the global village, but in particular, Occupy Wall Street in the global village. Shortly after Occupy Wall Street began breaking big in New York City and around the United States and around the world, and by the way, kudos to Canada for Adbusters coming up with the initial call to action that resulted in the global village a little less than a year ago. But in the fall of 2011, I was asked to go on a television show on Fox News and talk about the global village. And I was asked questions like, well, what's the matter with the people at Occupy Wall Street, which I was also asked to talk about. What's the matter with those people? Why don't they have a list of demands? What is their top demand? And I said, you don't understand the fundamental communication dynamics of Occupy Wall Street. When you're asking what is their top demand, you're in effect saying, what is their lead story? Well, that's from television. Or maybe you're asking, what is the headline? Well, that's from newspapers. But in the global village that's served by new media and the internet, that's served by Wikipedia, YouTube, Facebook, all of those media, Twitter, blogging. In those media, there is no headline and there is no lead story because all the communication is the lead story. And that's because the consumers have already become producers insofar as they can select what they want to focus on. This is in addition to producing their own information if they want, but the fundamental decision process which most media has editors and producers who decide, well, what will the headline be? What's going to be on the front page of the New York Times? What is the lead story on this newscast? Those are decisions that are made by producers and editors in old media, but in our new media global village, those decisions are made by the consumers themselves. So, did the people in Occupy Wall Street read McLuhan and decide to tailor and base their communication systems on McLuhan's writings? Did they read my writings? I doubt it. And this gets at a very important point regarding both McLuhan's ideas in the first place and their actualization and realization in today's global village and Occupy Wall Street as a second point. McLuhan was not clairvoyant. I worked with McLuhan. He was the brightest, most brilliant person and most exciting mind I ever had the pleasure to work with. Unfortunately, just briefly for a few years at the end of his life in the 1970s. And McLuhan was not some swami who looked into a crystal ball, into a Prester John speculum, and was able to see another time in the future. In fact, what McLuhan was doing is he understood on a very profound level the nature of human communications, what was important in human communication. And he therefore was able to see where media, where they would be headed. And the same is true of Occupy Wall Street. It's not as if they read McLuhan. Some people in the Occupy Wall Street movement no doubt have, but it's not as if the movement was in some sense based on McLuhan in the way that, say, communism was based on and is based on Karl Marx. No, it's not like that at all. What it is that the Occupy Wall Street movement reflects an understanding of the communication system that has come into being and exists already. A system in which, again, there is no headline, there is no lead story, because we face a multiplicity of very difficult problems. And ranking them is the old-fashioned way of doing it. But there's something else that Occupy Wall Street represents on the more purely political level. But this also has to do very profoundly with the global village. And that's the difference between representative democracy and direct democracy. Now, one of the great developments in 2007 was the Arab Spring, a series of revolutions which are still continuing, for example, currently in Syria, and all the horrible things that the regime there is now doing, trying to stop that. But it did succeed to some degree in Egypt, in Tunisia. It did not succeed so far in Iran, where the Green Revolution did not succeed. But in all of those cases, social media played and are still playing a major role. Now, a lot of people, when those revolutions began to happen, and prior to Occupy Wall Street, began saying, well, you see this is a rise of democracy against the dictatorships in the Middle East and those countries in North Africa. That was true enough, but there was a deeper element to that, which became clear with Occupy Wall Street. I first realized that there was something more going on than just a revolution against dictatorships when my wife and I were in Spain about a year ago, actually for a great conference in Barcelona, celebrating the centenary of McLuhan's birth. And we were walking down the Rambla, beautiful thoroughfare there, and we saw some demonstrations. And I asked one of the organizers of the conference, what are these demonstrations about? Is it protesting a political party? And it was explained to me that no, they were just protesting the overall economic conditions. They didn't have a particular problem with the government. They had a problem with the overall system. And I began to realize that this was coming from the same spring of democracy as the Arab Spring, but it was not something that was being directed against a dictatorship, because Spain was and is democracy. And so I was not surprised when the Indignado movement in Spain, in effect, popped up in the United States, but it was known as Occupy Wall Street, and then in many other places around the world. Because what was going on, and what is still going on, is a protest not against a dictatorship, but in effect against representative democracy. Representative democracy in which people do not have direct control over political decisions, in which people are, in effect, not producers of their political realms. And that's why in the United States and in other countries there's so much concern about the banks and the way that money affects politics. And it is representative democracy itself, which is the not so subtle target of Occupy Wall Street, which also explains why Occupy Wall Street has not fielded any political candidates. It's because what is at issue here is the system of representative democracy itself. Now, we're still at the very early stages, obviously, of Occupy Wall Street. Some people think it may be over because they haven't seen the massive demonstrations that we saw last year. I think it's quite the opposite, that we're just at the beginning. I also don't think, when I talk about the actions against representative democracy, that we're going to just see governments change overnight, because that's not the same as when there's a revolution against
2 minutes, Paul.
Okay, I got that. So what in fact we are going to see, I think, is a very subtle but profound change in the very nature of our democratic system itself, of which Occupy Wall Street is really the first mode of expression. And it's going, however, to take time as people begin to realize that, well, they don't have to wait to read something in the newspaper. They don't have to wait to watch it on television. They can write about it. They can talk about it. And so I think that here we are now, a year after the centenary, and therefore 101 years after McLuhan's birth. 1962 to 2012, well, you can do the arithmetic there. That's sort of a nice round number, but the global village that McLuhan wrote about in 1962 is now, on all areas, shimmering into reality, almost like something being beamed through time through Star Trek. So I'll be watching for developments and writing about them and reading about them. And I hope that you stay tuned to what's happening in the world, because I think that we are now part of perhaps the most profound revolution in communication and political governance since the invention of the alphabet and the printing press, which brought into being our representative democracies. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Paul.